I never thought betrayal could come dressed in family ties. The day I unlocked the door to my $850,000 home, my sister was already inside, smirking like she owned the place. "Dad promised this to me as my wedding gift," she said, her voice dripping with certainty. My father stood behind her, laughing, and told me I didn't belong here. My hands trembled, but I stayed silent, because silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. If I told you that one text, one deed, and one plan could turn their cruelty upside down, would you believe me? I used to believe loyalty was the foundation of family. That's what I told myself through every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every desperate phone call that always seemed to come when I was at my lowest. My father's debts, my sister's endless crises, my mother's midnight panic attacks, they all came to me first, and I answered every time. When my father borrowed money and couldn't pay it back, I signed the checks. When my sister fell behind on rent, I transferred the funds without hesitation. When hospital bills arrived for my mother, I was the one who shouldered them, cutting corners in my own life to keep them afloat. They said thank you, of course. They even praised me in front of others, painting me as the dependable daughter, the strong sister, the one who always came through. And I wore that title like a badge of honor. For years, I thought their gratitude was love. I thought their smiles meant belonging. I thought I was building something sacred, proving myself worthy of family. But underneath every word of praise was something colder, sharper. I began to realize that I wasn't being celebrated. I was being used. They didn't see me as a daughter or sister. They saw me as an open wallet, a reliable crutch, someone they could lean on without ever worrying if I might break. To them, I wasn't Rachel, a woman with dreams and limits. I was a resource, an endless supply line. The truth came to me slowly, like water seeping under a locked door. It was in the way my father dismissed my own struggles. When I mentioned the stress of covering his debts, he laughed it off and said, "That's what family is for." When I tried to set boundaries, my sister accused me of being selfish, her voice breaking into crocodile tears that made me feel like a monster. Love had become a tool they wielded against me. Guilt was their weapon of choice, and I, foolish, loyal, let them use it. Still, I told myself I was imagining things. That's what we do when we love too much. We bend logic until it breaks. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe they really did care, and I just couldn't see it clearly. So I ignored the warning signs, buried the doubts, and kept giving. I wanted to believe in the fantasy that family would always protect me. But the cracks widened. I discovered one day that my father had hidden financial documents from me. Papers that revealed loans taken out in my name without my consent. He brushed it off when I confronted him, calling it a misunderstanding, insisting he meant to pay them off quickly. My instincts screamed otherwise, but I swallowed my anger, convincing myself it wasn't worth the fight. Then there was the group chat. I found out by accident my sister borrowed my laptop one afternoon and forgot to log out. The chat was full of mocking comments about me, how I was too uptight, how I owed them for everything they had done in raising me, how I was lucky to even have them around. My stomach twisted as I read line after line of betrayal from the very people I had bled for. But even then, I told myself not to overreact. They didn't mean it. Maybe it was just a bad joke. That's how deep my denial ran. I blamed myself for even feeling hurt. I thought, maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I'm not as generous as I should be. Maybe they're right, and I owe them more. That's the kind of poison toxic families feed you. It convinces you that pain is proof of love, that abuse is evidence of belonging, and I drank it willingly, desperate not to lose them, desperate to keep the illusion alive. At night, I lay awake, scrolling through my bank account, watching the numbers dwindle, wondering how long I could keep this up. My chest tightened with every new expense, every new demand. But when the phone rang at 2 a.m., I still picked it up. When my father's voice cracked on the line, I still reached for my credit card. When my sister texted, "I don't know what I'll do if you don't help," I still transferred the money. Because love, I thought, was supposed to hurt. Looking back, I can see how the trap was built, carefully, methodically. It wasn't one big betrayal, but 1,000 tiny cuts, each disguised as love. By the time I realized how much I had lost, I was already bleeding out. And yet, even then, I couldn't walk away. I couldn't imagine a life without them, even if they were the ones chaining me to misery. I was too afraid of being alone, too conditioned to think I needed their approval to exist. So I stayed and I paid, and I smiled through the pain. But everything changed the day I unlocked the door to my own home, the house I bought with every ounce of sacrifice I had made. I thought it was my sanctuary, the one place they couldn't touch. I thought I had finally built something that belonged to me. I was wrong, because standing there in the middle of my living room was my sister, smirking like she owned it. And in that moment, I realized the biggest red flag wasn't in the group chats or hidden papers. It was right there, waiting for me in the house I thought was safe. The day I opened the door to my new home, the air was supposed to feel different, lighter, safer, like a fresh start. But instead, the first thing I saw was my sister standing in the middle of the living room, her arms folded across her chest, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. She didn't look like a guest, she looked like she belonged. "This house," she said, her voice sharp with entitlement. "Dad promised it to me as my wedding gift." I froze. For a moment, I couldn't process the words. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I had scraped together every dollar, sacrificed every comfort to buy this house, my sanctuary, my proof that I could build a life of my own. And now here she was, claiming it like I had no right to exist inside my own walls. Before I could even respond, my father's laughter filled the room. It wasn't the warm, reassuring laugh I remembered from childhood. It was cold, mocking. He stepped in behind her, his eyes scanning the space like an appraiser. "You don't belong here," he said flatly. "This isn't really yours." I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. I wanted to scream, to shove them both out the door, to demand they respect what I had built. But my body betrayed me. My hands shook, my lips pressed shut, my silence thick with pain. Then came the twist I hadn't expected. My sister pulled out a folder from her purse, sliding it across the counter with a triumphant smile. Inside were documents, deeds, contracts, papers, meant to show that the house wasn't truly mine. My father leaned on the counter, nodding as if the papers confirmed everything he'd said. For a split second, I believed them. The ground tilted beneath me as I scanned the pages, my vision blurring. Could they really have taken this from me, too? But as I looked closer, I saw the inconsistencies. Signatures that weren't mine, dates that didn't align, numbers that made no sense. It was a fabrication, a desperate attempt to rewrite reality. Still, they stood there, united against me, confident I would fold the way I always had. I didn't speak. My silence was suffocating, but beneath it was something new, something sharp. I wasn't surrendering. I was calculating. They mistook my quiet for weakness, but I knew better. And as I closed the folder and set it aside, I thought, this isn't over, not by a long shot. I kept my composure until they left. Only then, behind locked doors, did the weight crash down on me. I sank to the floor, clutching my knees, the tears coming fast and hot. For years I had convinced myself their betrayals were small, forgivable, the cost of family love. But this was the breaking point. That night, as I sat at my desk with swollen eyes, I stumbled upon something that confirmed the depth of their treachery. Sorting through old files, I found correspondence between my father and his lawyer, letters, drafts, notes, all pointing to one horrifying truth. He had already begun the process of rewriting his will. In the new version, I wasn't included at all. Everything, assets, properties, investments, would go to my sister. The betrayal cut deeper than I could bear. My chest ached, my breathing shallow. To him, I was nothing but a disposable daughter, useful until I had served my purpose, and when I was no longer convenient, I was erased. But the blows didn't stop there. As I dug deeper, more secrets surfaced. My father had used money I gave him years ago, money I thought was for emergencies, to fund a failed investment scheme. Instead of admitting his mistake, he shifted the blame, telling others I had insisted on the deal, tarnishing my name to cover his failure. I felt sick. Every sacrifice I had made, every dollar I had poured into the black hole of their demands had been twisted into a weapon against me, and now they stood in my home, daring to claim it as theirs, erasing me from my own life. I cried until my body felt empty. Alone in that house, the silence pressed down on me, heavier than their words ever had. But even in the middle of my despair, something stirred inside me. A fragile flame, faint but steady. I couldn't let this continue. I couldn't keep playing the fool in their game. For the first time in my life, I saw them clearly, not as family, but as predators who had fed on my loyalty for too long. And though my tears hadn't yet dried, a thought cut through the grief like a blade. This ends here. I won't be their victim any longer. I looked at the folder again, at the forged documents they thought would break me, and I whispered into the empty room, "You've underestimated me for the last time." From that night forward, everything changed, because I knew with every fiber of my being that I was no longer a pawn in their game. The night after I found the forged documents, I couldn't sleep. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to shut down. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my sister's smirk, my father's laugh, the folder filled with lies. The betrayal pressed against my ribs like a weight, but beneath the pain, another instinct awakened, the need to fight back. Not with shouting, not with fists or reckless rage, but with evidence, strategy, and precision. So I began where every truth hides these days, the digital trail. I opened my laptop and combed through old messages, screenshots, emails. I revisited group chats that once stung like salt in an open wound, reading with fresh eyes. This time, I wasn't the broken daughter desperate for their approval. I was a detective, scanning every line for inconsistencies, every careless word they thought would disappear into the void. My fingers shook as I took screenshots, saved them in hidden folders, backed them up to cloud accounts they didn't know existed. Each capture was a weapon, each thread of conversation another stitch in the tapestry of their lies unraveling. From there, I turned to voice memos. My father had a habit of leaving long, rambling voicemails. Pleas for money wrapped in guilt and half-threats. I had saved them out of obligation, but now they became gold. His voice, his words, his manipulation, recorded and undeniable. I labeled each one, cataloging them carefully, as if preparing for trial. The banking records were the hardest. Hours bled into days as I dug through transactions, trying to follow the path of the money I had given. I expected the numbers to sting, but nothing could have prepared me for what I uncovered. Buried in the statements was a loan, massive, years old, and taken out in my name. My heart slammed against my ribs as I read it again and again, unable to breathe. They had stolen more than my money. They had stolen my identity, my future, shackling me to a debt I never agreed to. The betrayal grew darker. This wasn't just manipulation. It was theft, fraud, a crime carved into the very foundation of my life. And the worst part? They had hidden it so carefully that I would never have known if I hadn't gone digging. I closed the laptop, my pulse pounding in my ears. The room felt smaller, the air thinner, as if the walls themselves were closing in. But instead of collapsing under the weight of the discovery, something inside me hardened. They didn't know I had found this. They didn't know every screenshot, every voice memo, every document was becoming an arsenal. And they certainly didn't know that every brick they had used to build their web of lies was now being pried loose, one by the very daughter they had underestimated. They thought silence was surrender. They were wrong. Silence was gathering strength, and each piece of evidence I held wasn't just proof. It was the first crack in the wall they thought would never fall. They didn't know it yet, but each file I saved was another stone pulled from the foundation. They didn't know that every proof I found was the brick that would one day bring down their fortress of deception. They didn't know that every lie had a shadow, and I was learning how to shine the light. They didn't know, but they would. They don't know that every piece of evidence I find is the brick that breaks down the wall of lies. When my evidence was secure, I turned to something even more powerful, allies. For years, I had faced my family's manipulation alone, isolated by their tactics. But this time, I refused to carry the weight by myself. I called an old friend, someone who had stood by me through smaller storms, and I told her everything. She didn't hesitate. She connected me to a lawyer she trusted, a woman known for her sharp mind and unshakable integrity. Meeting that lawyer was like breathing air after nearly drowning. She listened without judgment, took notes with precision, and assured me I wasn't crazy. What my family had done wasn't just immoral, it was illegal. For the first time, someone spoke the truth aloud. I was a victim of fraud, of coercion, of systematic abuse. Then came the financial advisor, who helped me trace the money, showing me exactly where it had gone and how it could be proven. Piece by piece, my scattered fragments of evidence became a coherent story, a narrative strong enough to stand in any courtroom, to silence any denial. But the most unexpected ally arrived in the form of my aunt. She had always been quiet at family gatherings, watching from the edges, never fully joining the drama. One evening, she called me privately, her voice trembling. She confessed she had overheard conversations between my father and his lawyer. He hadn't just planned to rewrite the will, he had attempted to sell land that legally belonged to me. Land I hadn't even realized was in my name. The words knocked the air out of me. For years, my family had plotted in shadows, carving pieces of my life away without a second thought. And here was my aunt, pulling the curtain back, giving me the final puzzle piece. For the first time in months, maybe years, I didn't feel completely alone. Someone had chosen to stand with me, not against me. Someone believed me, defended me, and gave me strength when I had nearly run out. The relief was so overwhelming I cried. Not the broken, bitter tears of betrayal, but the kind that cleansed, the kind that made space for something new, hope. In that moment, I realized the war I was fighting wasn't just mine. I wasn't a solitary soldier in a hopeless battle. I had allies, I had power, and I had truth on my side. With this ally, I knew I had my most important piece. The reunion was set in my parents' home, the place where every childhood memory had once lived. The living room smelled of roasted turkey and wine, laughter filling the air. From the outside, it looked like any other family gathering. But beneath the surface, tension coiled like a snake, ready to strike. They thought I would play my old role, the quiet daughter, too scared to speak, too desperate to keep the peace. I sat at the long dining table, listening to the chatter, every smile from my sister feeling like a blade. She raised her glass, her diamond engagement ring glinting in the light, and said, "Here's to family, to promises kept, and futures secure." The words were for me, and everyone knew it. My father chuckled, leaning back, the proud patriarch watching his chosen heir. My chest burned, but I kept my face calm. Because tonight wasn't about rage, tonight was about revelation. I stood slowly, letting the room quiet down. Dozens of eyes turned toward me, expecting maybe a toast or some awkward gratitude. Instead, I pulled a folder from my bag and placed it on the table. The room hushed to a brittle silence. "These," I said evenly, "are the real documents." I opened the folder and spread the deed to my house across the table. My name, my signature, my mortgage payments, all undeniable. Then came the screenshots, the emails, the voice memos of my father, begging, manipulating, twisting. One by one, I laid them out like cards in a game no one realized they had already lost. Gasps rippled through the room. My sister's smirk collapsed. My father leaned forward, his face draining of color as the evidence stacked higher and higher. I could feel the air shift, family members whispering, doubt flickering in their eyes. "This is my house," I said firmly, my voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. "This is my life, and every lie you've spun to take it from me ends here." For a moment, silence ruled. My father opened his mouth, ready to deny, to twist, to gaslight as he always had. But before he could speak, I pressed play on my phone. His own voice filled the room, begging for money, mocking me behind my back, admitting to debts he swore never existed. He froze. My sister's hand gripped her wineglass so tightly I thought it might shatter. The table erupted, shocked murmurs, heads turning, eyes burning holes into the two people who had always played the victim, always claimed power. I looked around, locking eyes with each relative who had ever believed their lies. And then I said, "You wanted a performance? Consider this the truth you've all ignored." I gathered my papers slowly, sliding them back into the folder. My silence carried more weight than any shouting ever could, but deep inside, I wasn't finished. But the next blow shocked them even more. The fallout began instantly. The next morning, my phone buzzed nonstop. My sister had taken to social media, spinning the story into something grotesque. She painted herself as the victim, claiming I had stolen her inheritance, that I was cruel, manipulative, even dangerous. My father chimed in, adding fuel, gaslighting to anyone who would listen. For a brief, terrible moment, it worked. Friends texted, confused, asking if the rumors were true. I felt the sting of betrayal all over again, the ground shaking beneath me. But what they didn't know, what I had planned for, was that I already anticipated this move. I had uploaded every document, every recording, every piece of proof into a secure drive. And when their smear campaign began, I released it. Screenshots, audio files, bank statements, all time-stamped, all irrefutable. The narrative flipped instantly. People saw the truth. Messages of support poured in. Even those who had doubted me before couldn't argue against cold, undeniable evidence. My sister's credibility cracked in real time. My father's authority, once untouchable, collapsed like a house of cards. Still, even in victory, my body trembled. I remember sitting alone in my living room, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. I wasn't immune to the pain. I wasn't some unfeeling machine. My heart still ached, my chest still burned. Winning didn't erase the wounds. It only proved I had survived them. I cried that night, not out of despair, but release. For the first time, the tears didn't come from weakness, but strength. I had faced them and I had not crumbled. Yet deep down, I knew the story wasn't finished, because justice doesn't end with exposure. It begins there, and I promised myself I would see it through. But justice does not stop there. The evidence I released spread faster than I could have imagined. Within days, whispers turned into full-blown conversations, and conversations into accusations. My father, once a man who thrived on respect and authority, now found his name spoken in hushed tones, laced with disbelief. My sister, who had prided herself on being the favored child, was suddenly the subject of ridicule, her credibility shredded in the very community she had hoped to impress. But exposure was only the beginning. The law eventually knocked on their door. My lawyer had meticulously prepared every document, every screenshot, every recording, and when she presented it to the authorities, there was no denying the truth. Fraud, identity misuse, forgery. These weren't just family disputes anymore. They were crimes. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office when the news came through. An investigation had been formally opened. My hands trembled as I gripped the armrest of my chair. Part of me wanted to laugh, to scream that finally justice had caught up. Another part of me wanted to collapse, exhausted from carrying the burden so long. My father's bluster didn't survive the scrutiny. Confronted with evidence, his usual tactics, denial, gaslighting, shifting blame, crumbled. My sister, desperate, tried to shield herself by accusing him of masterminding everything. The family unit that had stood against me fractured before my eyes, each of them scrambling to protect themselves. Then came the twist I hadn't anticipated. Some of my relatives, the ones who had always stayed silent or sided with him out of fear, began to reach out. My cousins sent me a message. "We didn't know the extent. We believe you now." An uncle called to apologize for doubting me, his voice shaking, as he admitted he had ignored the signs for years. Even those who once mocked me during family gatherings began to distance themselves from my father and sister, unwilling to be dragged down with them. It was vindication, but it came with a price. Because as the truth spread, I realized justice wasn't neat or painless. It tore open wounds I thought had scarred over. Every revelation meant reliving the betrayal. Every supportive message a reminder of the years no one had believed me. For every ounce of satisfaction, there was another ounce of grief. And as I sat alone in my kitchen one evening, the folder of documents still on the table, I whispered to myself, I thought I had won, but the price of truth is heavier than I imagined. I thought I had won, but the price of truth was higher than that. The legal process moved forward, but for me, the real shift was less visible. My father's voice, once booming with authority, now carried no weight. His denials were hollow, his reputation stripped away. My sister's social media presence collapsed under the weight of ridicule. No one believed her carefully curated image anymore. Invitations to weddings, holidays, and community events stopped coming. The family that once wielded power now stood exposed, isolated, and yet I didn't feel the triumph I once thought I would. I watched my father struggle to hold on to his dwindling respect, my sister squirm under the glare of public shame. But rather than satisfaction, what I felt was something else, release. I didn't need to gloat or shout or demand apologies that would never come. Their downfall spoke louder than anything I could say. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the weight of their lies. I was free of them. I realized then that revenge, no matter how strategic, was never the end game. It wasn't about watching them fall. It was about watching myself rise from the wreckage. I remember walking out of the courthouse one morning, sunlight hitting my face, the crisp air filling my lungs. My lawyer congratulated me, my friends hugged me, but the real victory was internal. I no longer needed their approval. I no longer sought their validation. I had reclaimed my life, my voice, my identity, and in that clarity, I understood something I never had before. True justice wasn't about crushing them under the weight of their sins. It was about standing tall despite them. It was about walking forward unchained. So I let go of the anger, of the obsession with revenge. I didn't need to see them suffer to know I had won. Their power over me had evaporated, and that was enough. Because true justice is not just about victory, it's about freedom. After the storm of exposure and consequences, silence finally settled into my life. Not the suffocating silence of being ignored or manipulated, but the kind that felt like peace. I woke up in my own home, sunlight spilling across the floor, and for the first time in years, the weight on my chest was gone. The house no longer felt like a battleground. It was mine, undeniably, irrevocably mine. The first step in rebuilding was simple, yet monumental. Boundaries. I went no contact, no late-night calls from my father, no guilt-ridden texts from my sister, no family group chat buzzing with demands or ridicule. My phone, once a weapon they used against me, became my sanctuary. I blocked numbers, changed passwords, closed every door they could use to reach me. It wasn't easy. Silence, even when chosen, can sting. Part of me still craved the connection, the family dinners, the illusion of belonging. But every time the ache flared, I reminded myself what those connections had cost me. I reminded myself that love without respect is poison, and I had swallowed enough. Then came the twist. One afternoon, a letter arrived in my mailbox, handwritten, shaky with desperation. It was from my sister. She begged for forgiveness, claiming she had been misled, that she wanted to start over. A week later, a voicemail from my father followed. His voice cracked as he said he wanted to make amends. That family was all we had. For a brief moment, my chest tightened. Old habits whispered, maybe they've changed. Maybe this time will be different. But I knew better. Forgiveness wasn't the same as reconciliation. They didn't want healing, they wanted access. So I burned the letter, I deleted the voicemail, and with a steady hand I whispered aloud, I am not the same woman anymore. I am not the same person anymore. From that moment forward, my energy shifted. I poured myself into my career, no longer drained by constant demands. Without their weight on my shoulders, I thrived. Opportunities I once ignored blossomed. I took risks, said yes to projects, built connections that weren't tied to manipulation, but to mutual respect. Within 2 years, I expanded my income enough to purchase another property, an investment, not a burden. This time, the papers bore only my name, untouched by deceit. But success wasn't just financial. I built a chosen family, people who saw me not as a resource but as a person, friends who sat with me on quiet evenings, who laughed with me over wine, who held my hand when memories threatened to pull me back. With them, love felt different, gentle, reciprocal, free. My story didn't stay private for long. One night, encouraged by a friend, I shared pieces of it online. Not names or details, but the essence of survival, betrayal, and reclaiming power. I didn't expect much, but the post spread like wildfire. Strangers reached out, saying my words mirrored their lives. Messages poured in. You've given me courage. I thought I was alone. Thank you for speaking the truth. I realized then that my pain had become more than scars. It had become a lantern. By exposing my journey, I had unknowingly lit the way for others still trapped in their own toxic cycles. And as I stood in front of the mirror one morning, preparing for a new day, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She wasn't broken. She wasn't the desperate daughter begging for scraps of affection. She was whole, strong, free. The arc of my life had bent from despair to liberation, from betrayal to rebirth. I had walked through fire, and though it burned, it also cleansed. The ending wasn't a scream of victory, but a quiet certainty. I no longer lived in survival mode. I was thriving. I did not just survive, I whispered, smiling at my reflection. I was reborn. I didn't just survive. I was reborn.